20.
It's November 24. Ukraine Media Center Ukraine Forum continues its operation. My name is Svetlana Cheprenko, and now within Brain-Hub, the main discussion platform of Ukraine, we will talk about the gender-based violence and assistance to those affected by gender-based violence during the war. It's very important because today the global promotion starts 16 days against violence. This issue is quite present in Ukraine under the conditions of full-scale invasion, because at large account war is violence, and the matters of gender-based violence got extremely jeopardized during the war. So let me introduce our guest today. It's Kateryna Levchenko, Government Commissioner for Gender Policy, Halyna Skipalska, Executive Director of the ICF Ukrainian Foundation for Public Health, Country Director at HealthRight International in Ukraine, Maryna Lehenka, a lawyer at Strada-Ukraine NGO. Joining us online will be Anna Dub, head of the Brave&Safe Integrated Center for Comprehensive Support for GBV and the Consequences of War Survivors, Tetiana Franchuk, a psychologist at SafeWomenHub, an online platform that deals with cases of conflict-related sexual violence, and Kateryna Franchuk, a psychologist at Barnahus Child Advocacy Center. So this problem was at large scale even before the war, and now the police reports about the decrease of cases of violence, the fall of number of complaints in Ukraine. But we understand that these statistics may not just correspond with the reality, and is the result of the fact that the lesser number of women started complaining about this. So what may be the reason for that? Well, let me put it like this. Talking about statistics and about the government authorities, it's maybe better described by Ms. Kateryna Levchenko, and I'm happy to be here to discuss this important topic, which is important not only for the law enforcement agencies, government authorities, but also for the women and the civil society. The day of today's press conference is special because we have an opportunity to cover quite important matters in the eve of the annual action 16 days against violence, because on the 29th of November, the General Assembly back in the year 1999 announced that they start an action of 16 days to counter the violence on a global level, and until the 10th of December we will celebrate the dates that celebrate the countering of any crimes related to violation of human rights. And it's important for Ukraine as well, because on the 24th of February of 2022 the full-scale war has started in Ukraine, which is a clear expression of the notion violence. The full-scale invasion by Russia is of disastrous effect on all of the Ukrainians. We hear a lot about the mental health of the Ukrainians because the international agencies survey the Ukrainians. But not only the risk, but the number of cases of violence has grown, and this violence has transformed into something that has a different type of definition. Today we will be discussing the sexual violence related to conflicts. We have specialists present here because it's not only violence but torture and a serious violation of human rights. As of October 2023, the Office of Prosecutor General of Ukraine documented 241 cases of conflict-related sexual violence. We are organization SafeWomenHub. We have 96 customers who were affected by sexual violence related to conflict that are being helped by our social workers and psychologists. We understand that the war creates serious psycho-emotional tension. It makes us anxious about our lives, our future. It makes us experience some economic difficulties, and all those challenges are only jeopardizing the risks of gender-based domestic violence, and thus influence negatively not only the well-being of women and children but the society in whole. Using this opportunity, I would like to thank the participants of today's discussion, thanks to whom we will cover such topics as the actual condition of the problems of gender-based violence. We will talk about the mechanism of reporting through different structures. There are specialists working in the platforms headed by the organizations of the civil society. We will consider the specifics of work with the people affected by violence, and we will have an opportunity to cover a topic of violence against children who were either affected or became witnesses of violence. We have another participant of this event. It will be my pleasure to introduce Nadia to you, who is a customer of our social housing, and Miss Nadia will share not so much of her story, but rather how she was able to cope with those difficult circumstances in her life. And it's my honor to invite Ms. Kateryna Levchenko, the Government Commissioner on Gender Policy, PhD in philosophy. Professor, Ms. Kateryna, you have an incredible experience in promotion of gender equality on both national and international levels, and during this time you've overcome a lot of challenges, including the ones related to countering the violence in Ukraine. What is your opinion? How pressing is the issue of gender-based violence? How did the war influence the number of cases of domestic violence, and what are the mechanisms for assistance to those affected by gender-based violence, and what are the steps undertaken by the government to help those people affected by all types of violence, including sexual violence related to conflict? Thank you very much, Ms. Halyna. You've asked a lot of questions that require a lot of time to answer. Let me try to be brief. And if there are any additional questions arising, I'm ready to answer them as well. So first of all, the problem of gender-based violence, it remains just as actual for Ukraine as it used to be. It's not a national Ukrainian problem. It's a problem existing all over the world. Did the war jeopardize it? Yes, exactly, just like all other social problems, because our lives have changed cardinally. Some families have their resources decreased. Institutions were destroyed that were providing all types of assistance related to coping with domestic violence. We are in constant stress, in constant grief because of the losses that we bear, and we live under very heavy psychological burden, and it definitely influences the situation with domestic violence as a part of the gender-based violence. Does it tell us that the government doesn't pay attention to it? In no case. Those all problems are in the focus of government policy. The fact that Ukraine ratified the Istanbul Convention to counter the violence against women and the domestic violence is a bright illustration of the fact that this problem is in focus of government policy. And this topic is in focus of the Vice Prime Minister on European and Euro-Atlantic integration, Ministry of Social Policy, law enforcement agencies, national police. It's in the focus of the First Lady, Miss Olena Zelenska, and next week there will be an extensive information campaign starting to cover this topic. And this topic should be also in focus of the local governments, because it's their responsibility to honor this day to help the victims of violence. And even during the time of full-scale invasion, there are about 180 million hryvnias contemplated in the budget to develop and promote services for those affected by violence. So this subsidy was also existing in year 21. It was contemplated for year 22 as well, but all those money were channeled to the armed forces of Ukraine. And now in year 2023 the funds are allocated again. So talking in numbers, we know that annually within the last 7 to 10 years, the number of documented cases of violence in Ukraine is growing, which in my humble opinion as an expert in this topic is an indicator of the fact that the problem is going from latent area to area of visualization, which says that us as a society will learn to identify this problem, to detect the cases, will learn not to keep silent about it. And it also says that on part of the government institutions who are supposed to react to this situation, the level of competence grows as well. Police, prosecutor's office, social workers, free legal aid, and civil organizations. In year 2022, the number of reports on domestic violence significantly decreased. This tendency requires additional study, but it's most likely to be related to the fact that other matters, such as matter of survival, were more present for the majority of our population. However, the year 23 demonstrates the trend for growing of reports again. Within the last half a year, there was a growth of more than 40% compared to the equal period of year 2022, and we'll come up to the same figures. We'll check out the results for the 12th month of the year 2022, and those figures evidence that the issue is still present and there is a response to it as well. In June this year, there was a meeting of the Commission for Coordination of Executive Branches to ensure equal rights for men and women, and it was a very intense session where the Commissioner for Human Rights, the First Lady, and Prosecutor General were participating. We were reviewing the matters of gender-based violence during the war with a count of all the stakeholders, and upon the session and the meeting there was a program developed to be implemented by the executive powers shortly, but some of the previous programs, they did not take into account the new challenges that arisen due to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russian Federation. We include more subjects in these processes, we train more specialists. The training of specialists is underway in a very intense way, but our vision is to have such training to become a part of the training of the experts in the higher educational institutions, not only under the training programs that might be cancelled further on. Also, I would like to mark the work of the Office of Prosecutor General, who created a specific unit to counter the hate-based violence crimes. So there's a lot of problems, but we are on the way of solving them. And in this sense, it's very important to establish the proper coordination between the government, international organizations, and civil society. And what's also necessary is the intense support in the mass media to make sure the problem is not marginalized. We need to continue discussing both the problem and the services that are created in the state that may be used by those affected by the cases of violence. Thank you very much. Ms. Halyna decided to facilitate my work as the moderator, but let me ask you, Ms. Kateryna, another question. Now, in the society, when we talk about violence, we mostly consider the aspects of physical and sexual violence, but there are a lot of other aspects, such as financial violence, psychological violence. What is done to expand the understanding that it's not about beating and sex? What is being done to prevent such cases of violence? Maybe some work with the men who mostly become abusers and persons who commit such types of crime. Well, yes, we wouldn't like to blame the men, but statistically talking, about 85–87% of persons who committed crimes within years 2021, 22, and 23 are men. So the problem is in the very structure of the society, what we call the patriarchal society, and fighting the crime only by providing assistance to the victims, but without changing the attitude to the violence, changing the relations within the organization of the society itself, the relations between the men and women. It's very important thing. You know, what I can say is that the work is a little bit beyond the area of law enforcement and social work. To me, very important instrument is, well, to cope with the violence and the violent behavior, forming of non-violent relations is a strategy to ensure gender equality in education sector, which was developed and adopted by the government to make sure that the victims don't feel themselves economically dependent on violators. However, the people who were affected by the violence, I mean the women, they don't leave the families, they don't leave the epicenter of violence because they're dependent financially. So we should empower the women economically by narrowing the gap in salaries between the men and women. There is a government strategy aimed at overcoming stereotypes regarding male and female professions, aimed at discrimination, gender-based discrimination at workplaces. It's aimed to have those masculinized sectors of economy to attract more women, in the same way that we should minimize those gaps in feminized spheres of work, such as education, for example. This is why, without complex activities aimed to ensure the gender equality in the society, we're not going to be successful in fighting violence, because violence is an extreme expression of discrimination, which is based on those harmful patriarchal stereotypes and structures that impede us from moving faster and develop as a modern society. Thank you very much, Ms. Kateryna. So probably let's talk about different programs that exist to support the women who were affected by the violence. Ms. Maryna, let's talk with you. First of all, you represent Strada-Ukraine. There are 2 hotlines for the women who were affected by the violence. The women can call there. So what are the tendencies that you observe in reporting by the women? What work is being done. So what's going on? Thank you, Ms. Svetlana. Strada-Ukraine really ensures the 24/7 operation of two hotlines. One is to prevent the human trafficking, domestic violence, and gender discrimination, and another hotline is for the youth and children. So both hotlines work 24/7, and with the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, they underwent a number of transformations because there are additional questions being asked on the both hotlines, and both hotlines started working as a lines of psychological support for women, for children who were affected in a broad sense by the war in Ukraine. Talking about the changes and transformations, first of all, it's switching of the children's hotline to 24/7 format because we started getting a lot of calls from children and youth who were staying in the shelters during the air raid alert. They were requiring psychological support, and we've understood that this line should be switched to 24/7 mode because we understand that children were supposed to rest during nighttime, but in modern realities, unfortunately, such rest is impossible. So talking about the tendencies of reporting, just like Ms. Kateryna Levchenko mentioned in the beginning of the war, the number of reports decreased significantly. It fell, in fact, to zero with regard to domestic violence. There were reports and requests regarding other legal issues related to evacuation, living abroad, acquisition of IDP status, and talking about the domestic violence. Those who were affected, they were calling and saying like excuses for reporting like the war. It's no time to report the domestic violence, and we said no, even regardless the fact of the war, the situation with the domestic violence, it's intolerable. It still requires reacting. So for the time being, the number of reports is at the same level as in year 21. Talking in figures, it's about 38,000 reports that we've got in year 2021, and more than 38,000 and a half within the year 22. And in this year 23, we are at the same level, which means that the number of reports doesn't fall. The problem is still in pressing. We have more reports coming from the people affected by the conflict-related sexual violence. They started emerging right after the occupation of Kyiv region, and this category that emerged, well, I mean the category of reports that emerged in year 2014 after the beginning of the war, but now the number of such reports is about 70, and yes, we have such reports of sexual violence. Talking about the hotline for children and youth, within the year 21, we got more than 131 calls, 131,000 calls, I'm sorry. And within the year 2022, the number has grown up to 1,708. And within this year, we've got more than 65,000 calls. So we are about to exceed the level, the pre-war level. So yes, both lines are working. We continue providing psychological, social, and legal aid through the telephone, both to kids and adults who were affected by gender-based violence, domestic violence, who were affected by the sexual violence related to conflict, and obviously to human trafficking. Thank you very much. Yet another way to get aid is to go to to report through the online platform SafeWomenHub. So can you please tell us a little bit more about this platform? Thank you very much. This is one of the initiatives that we as a Ukrainian Foundation for Public Health have started in April 2022, right after the beginning of the full-scale invasion. Why did we start it? Because on one hand we were observing that the number of women who are in need of psychological, social support or just advice during evacuation or relocation to Europe or inside Ukraine was growing. And on the other hand, we've seen that in our organization we had a team of psychologists, therapists who had an extensive experience of working with trauma and with those affected by domestic and gender-based violence who were leaving. Some of them have already left the country, some moved to the west of Ukraine, and those therapists, they were ready to start providing such types of aid, and with the support of On Women Foundation and with the help of Humanitarian Foundation, Women's Foundation of Peace and Humanitarian Support, we've launched this online platform where a lawyer and 3 therapists work. We have a team up to 30 volunteers, high-skilled psychologists who work on a volunteer basis with us. And talking about the coverage, within the period from April 2022 until today, we've covered more than 10,100 unique customer applications we calculated for the statistics. So the reports from women and girls from territories under Ukrainian control, temporarily occupied territories, those who left abroad and came back. So 718 customers who were affected by domestic violence, and 96 girls and women who were affected by the conflict-related sexual violence. So the majority of those women, they are complicated cases. I'm not afraid to say that it's a number of those women who are not in the statistics of the prosecutor's office, because the acceptance of trauma, the work of the psychologist, is still underway with them. It's not one meeting, one call. It's a fundamental work that takes 3, 6, 9, and for some more than a year of work with psychologists, psychotherapists, maybe even psychiatrists, to recuperate. And behind every story of a woman, there are facts and situations that a large number of people who one way or another indirectly are related to this situation, like loved ones, the family members, children, whose condition, psychological condition, health condition is affected by this situation, that for them there is no possibility so far to come out and say, yes, I am a victim of this type of violence and I'm ready to communicate with the journalists, because the journalists request us a lot about such cases. So this platform continues working. We cooperate with other organizations that provide services on spots, like the hotline of La Strada, centers of social services, other branches of our organization, like a center of integrated help, Barnahus Center, whose network is being expanded for children. And only thanks to this cooperation, we can first pick up a customer and then link them with a service, so they can receive that service at their place of residence. Thank you. Joining us today is Tetiana, a psychologist of this Barnahus platform. So what is your experience? What are the main problems that the women come to you with? How do you work with those problems? And it would be interesting to hear about the experience of work with the women who became the victims of sexual violence, and with those small number of women that Halyna mentioned about. Good afternoon, everybody. In reality, I'm with this platform from the very moment of its establishment. I see the structure of the requests being changed, and we've seen blackouts, massive shellings, massive missile strikes, liberation of Kherson, and it directly influences the intensity of reporting from the women. You know, when the air raid alert is on, when the women worry about their loved ones, when the territories are being liberated, not only those women from occupied, freshly liberated territories report to us, but also other women from other regions. They read the news, they talk to their loved ones, they worry about what's going on, and we continue receiving the requests from all those customers that we have. On a daily basis, we work with about 50 requests from different women. As Ms. Bogdana was saying, we have a team of operators who work with the requests. I remember a case when a woman was calling to us from temporarily occupied territories, and she had to go to the attic because the signal was better there. And it's one of multiple stories like this. We have a lot of consultations to support them. One woman was whispering from temporarily occupied territories because she was afraid she could be heard by her neighbors. That could result in some negative consequences. So we talk about the importance of it for women. It's important for them to continue taking the same drugs they were taking during bipolar disorders, depressive disorders, because when the territory is occupied, such possibility just is vanishing. So they call us to understand how they can act under circumstances they ended up in. The women who were the victims of sexual violence related to the conflict, they call us. They don't always talk about it during the first consultation within their first report. Well, but we can hear some symptoms that accompany such phenomena, like deterioration of sleep, deterioration of relations with the kids, with the family members. They ask us how to walk out in the street, how not to be afraid of the men, and only then we find out about those horrors that they survived. We find out how difficult it is for them to entwine it into their lives and continue moving on. And very frequently we observe suicidal thoughts and even attempts in them, and we continue working with them. We have to put together the safety plan, how to react to those anxious disorders and how to preserve their life and health. And sometimes we hear it from the women that they say, I feel easier now in the collective. I start talking to the men. I can walk out in the street. I'm not afraid to talk to men. And there was a story of a woman who was coming to a military hospital, and she said, I was entering the hospital. I've seen a lot of men dressed in uniforms, and I didn't feel numb. What's important also is the cooperation with those organizations that Ms. Halyna mentioned, the integrated centers, the multidisciplinary team to be engaged in work with those women, children therapists, multidisciplinary psychologists, so we can support the women and to look from different angles at her situation, that situation she's reporting. And when a woman comes with a depressive disorder who says she was not walking out in the street for 4 months because she was feeling it difficult, and the first place she went to was integrated center in Zaporizhia, and we worked a lot with her so she would be able to walk out in the street. Women get online or offline consultation on our platform depending on their place of residence. Additionally, they can obtain legal aid and assistance by a social worker. It can be some humanitarian aid or any kind of information regarding what she can do to support herself in other ways, having government institutions involved. Thank you very much for your team. I want to ask our technical team to get Miss Anna put on the screen. Miss Anna, let's talk about the operation of Brave and Safe platform that works in the South and east of Ukraine. For what I understand, you work in the areas close to the front lines in Zaporizhia region. So we would like to ask you about the specifics of your communication with the women there. What are the reports that you're facing there? What are the types of support that you provide to those women? Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Anna Dub. I'm a chief family doctor. I'm an IDP myself because my Polohiv community was occupied. We relocated our emergency medical aid center to Zaporizhia. We are really close to the front lines, and on the platform of our center, we've established the integrated center to support the people affected by the violence. So we integrate the centers of complex reaction and support of all people affected by violence, specifically by gender-based violence. So we are the entry gate. I am the entry gate. We work as a team, family workers, family doctors, civil workers, psychologists. We work on the platform of the emergency medical aid center. We also go to the places of mass concentration, but the specifics is that we work in the areas close to the front lines in the Zaporizhia region. 22 to 36 kilometers from the front line. We work with our beneficiaries who have a high level of stress and reaction to unpredictable circumstances, because sometimes the signal of alert cannot protect us from the possible aggression of the occupier. The members of our team know how to work, know how to react. We are mobile, and we can adapt to different conditions dictated to us by the battle area based on the safety and security concerns. People continue to be affected by the aggression, and still a good thing is that we cooperate with the sector of countering the domestic violence of the city of Zaporizhia. We have an extensive experience of support in cases of domestic violence to different families. We've visited 64 such families in Zaporizhia and 5 more families in the villages along the front line. We've helped 28 families with gender-based violence, specifically those who were affected by domestic violence. We also have the mutual support groups for the women who are affected by domestic violence. We continue imposing measures on prevention of stress as we live in the areas close to the front lines. And what I also want to emphasize, that when we had filtration camps with the occupied territories and humanitarian borders open, very frequently we had women coming and men and children as well coming to us with the same problem. As people were leaving the occupied territories, they were subject to different types of violence and tortures. They were forced to be undressed. But lately, like we've opened last week a case management team, a young woman fell in love with a boy, and first they were in abusive relations. He was psychologically abusing her first, but then he locked her in her good big house. He was beating her. She was able to run away, and she knew about me. She knew our lawyer, and she reported to us, and she said that I never thought this problem may ever happen to me. So it's important to continue providing this type of support, not only during the war, but sometimes we think that it will not ever concern us. We are socially active, we're young, but the violence doesn't choose between the social levels or the regions. But thanks to our complex response, thanks to our team, we will be able to overcome all those challenges dictated to us by the war. Thank you very much, Ms. Anna, for the great job you're doing, and we wish you success in achievement of all the goals that you set for yourself. And there's yet another aspect of this problem we're discussing, maybe the most difficult: assistance to the kids who were affected by the violence or who became the witnesses of the violence. We have Maryna with us, who is the psychologist of Barnahus Center. You work directly with the children. Can you please tell us about the specifics of your work? What are the difficulties that you're facing, and how do you help the people? Did the war influence the number of cases of violence related to children? Thank you very much. The violence against children is the most painful, the most sensitive topic, I guess. And Barnahus is a model of working with the children. It's implemented in Ukraine since 2021. The centers were deployed, international multidisciplinary centers who work on the Barnahus model, who provide support to children who were victims or witnesses of violence, who are a part of criminal investigations. And the goal is to help a child with the minimal risk of repeated traumatization to undergo processual activities, to obtain legal aid, medical aid, psychological aid. Let me give you a little bit of statistics, because it's a new model for Ukraine. Absolutely innovative, but increasingly important. Since September 22 until October 23, in all centers opened in Ukraine, 162 children received the services on the platforms of Barnahus centers. 83% of those children were the ones who were victims of violence, and 17% were those who were witnesses of the violence. There is yet another statistics within the last half a year about the sexual violence. Since March through November 2023, we have 73 children who were affected by sexual violence. But here we segregate victims and witnesses. We have 65 victims and 5 witnesses. There is a stereotype that it's mostly teens who are affected by sexual violence, but the statistics shows that they're mostly children under 10 years is the official statistics, and we're talking about criminal investigations. So those are the cases that are added to the register of pre-court investigations. In reality, the statistics is different, but there is a number of reasons why it's not documented. And in reality, we don't know what is the number of children who are the victims of sexual violence. One of the reasons is because children do not report it to the adults due to a number of reasons. Again, they fear that they are not to be trusted, or they will be punished for that. Or sometimes the children do report to the adults, but the adults do not report to the law enforcement agencies. Again, due to a number of reasons, like they fear this law enforcement system, or they don't believe a child, specifically when it's happening in a domestic environment, when it's a violence caused by some of the members of the families. And another reason is when law enforcement or the teachers in the school, when they get reports from the children, but they do not document that case because they don't believe the children. And talking about the way the Barnahus Center operates, I want to emphasize it's a disciplinary institution, which means that all of the services, as soon as a child gets in touch with the justice, all the services are being provided are under one roof. It's not like children walk around the law enforcement agencies, but all of them visit a child over there at the same premise. the lawyers, the prosecutors, psychologists, they work all together in team on every specific case. They will be different people, but the task is to plan the work with the child in a way to minimize the trauma for a child, to plan everything in the most efficient way possible, and to plan the help for the child so they undergo all those procedures with a minimal risk to their psychological health and physical health as well, and at the same time that they receive the necessary services. The algorithm is quite simple and clear. Maybe it's not so simple to implement it. So as soon as the case is added to the register of pre-court investigations, the multidisciplinary team is being gathered upon reporting to the Barnahus Center, and then we plan all the procedural activities on the platform of the center. The child can be, or a child can be interrogated. All the forensic activities are provided there. The children can be examined by the doctors, and after the process is over, because it's important as the process goes to ensure the therapeutic activities are not being performed in relation to a child, because they need to provide all proper evidences, and only then, as the situation is being closed for the child, they work with the traumatic experience with the psychologist, and the rest of the services are being provided on the level of the community, because we link them to the community. So what we work with, we need to understand that there is domestic violence and there is extra domestic violence, and sexual violence can be also a part of domestic violence. And we see that the violence, specifically sexual violence in related to the children, is performed by the closest relatives, like brothers, uncles, sometimes neighbors, so the persons from the closest circle. And talking about smaller kids and adolescents, we see that the adolescents are being affected by the sexual violence by the partners, usually under condition of alcoholic intoxication. So the perpetrators are usually the people who enjoy children's trust. And in Barnahus, we have these statistics that the number of cases of sexual violence against children has increased. Both prosecutor's office and law enforcement agencies talk about it. They confirm these statistics. And in Barnahus, psychologists work with the child, and they help children to talk. They use special tools, special methods. The children open up, they provide evidences that can be used in the court. And given this teamwork nature and the complex nature of the support, we have a successful practice for the time being, because Barnahus is the model that works in the best interest of the children and for the interest of the children. Thank you very much, Ms. Maryna. Yet another project that ensures the security of the women affected by the violence is the social housing. Ms. Halyna, can you please tell us about this project? What is the type of help that is being provided within this project? Well, there is a lot of beneficiaries of such services, and it's a huge breakthrough that Ukraine, thanks to, I don't know, to political will, ratification of Istanbul Convention has done. And such services are provided by both government institutions, local governments, some organizations of the national level, but also of the civil society. 10 years ago, Ukrainian Foundation of Civil Health created the first type of social housing. It was a model of a shelter for the women who under difficult life circumstances and the women who were the victims of domestic violence, gender-based violence, and we were promoting our model. We have 3 social flats in Kiev, Lviv, and Uzhhorod. We think about expansion. In fact, it's a shelter where women don't only reside, but also they receive rehabilitation services. They work with social workers and psychologists. It's when within 3 or 4 months we're trying to give women a fishing stick so they find resources to be able within 3 or 4 months or under these conditions of war 6 or 7 months to live the life, to be able to live the lives on themselves. Why do we call it social housing? We highlight the idea that we work with the women who have newly born kids, with those who are pregnant, who have children under 3 years. Is the category of women who find it very difficult to leave the perpetrator. And if there is a relocation added on top, when it turns out that the perpetrators are in the occupied territories, or that that perpetrator is an occupier, there's a lot of other aspects coming into effect, and we understand that the women are supposed to have somebody who will just help them get themselves together and continue moving on. And in those 3 social housing facilities, more than 150 mothers already received our support and more than 200 children. And this is exactly the indicator that demonstrates that, well, meanwhile, 6 to 7 children may live in that social housing, but we have even more than 25 or 30 children going through our social flats, the social housing facilities. We have very different conditions. We try to adapt them to the beneficiaries of our services. We try to help those mothers, and I have already announced it that we have one of our clients joining us today, Miss Nadia. If you are ready, please share your experience. You may remain seated. So please tell us about your way. What type of help did you receive at that social housing facility? Good afternoon. I'm a mother of a kid who is going to be 1 year and 10 months today. So as of the beginning of the war on the 24th of February, my son was 1 month old and I was in occupied territory in Chernihiv. It was very difficult to leave that area. However, I've made it out of there, and I found out about the social housing facility through internet, and it's my 5th month that I spent there. Within that period, I've adapted a little bit. I feel way easier. I visit a psychologist. I get help from social workers. I get legal aid. I've got a job. My kid is attending a kindergarten, and I want to thank this fund for extending this help, for having a place to come, because there is no place to go if you are a victim of domestic violence. And I appreciate the input of all the social workers who help us both physically and morally. Miss Nadia, thank you very much. I would also like to add that every woman who is a victim of a domestic violence, both physical and sexual, every woman who ends up in situations like this, I want them not to be afraid to go to these type of organizations, to these funds, to social workers. We're strong and we're all gonna make it. Thank you. We're fond of your strength and we wish all the best to you and your little son. I think on this phase, we may proceed to the questions from the floor. Good afternoon, Julia Kateryna, Ukrinform. I would like to ask one question from Ms. Kateryna Levchenko. You said that the government supports is not staying aside. You've mentioned that there are funds allocated in the state budget in 2023 in amount of 180 million hryvnias. So I'm curious, what is the amount allocated for the year 2024 and what this package contemplates? I said around 180 million. We have to double check the exact figure. So those funds are being managed by the Ministry of Social Policy, and based on the requests from the communities, those funds are allocated to either create a mobile team crisis room, a shelter, or to co-fund such type of work, or to support the work of existing facilities like that. Ms. Maryna Lehenka is joining us in this studio, who in year 2021 was directly involved in implementation of this subsidies program, and she can tell you in better detail about those technical things that were in place back then. So the community that sees a need of that is a very important thing to mention, because the community is supposed to articulate that need. So they fill the relevant form, they apply to the Ministry of Social Policy, and thereupon they participate in a contest, in a bid, and based on that bid, such work is being co-funded. And then the Ministry of Social Policy and the National Service of Ukraine is performing monitoring of how those funds are spent and how the help is provided in those services in the communities. So it's important for the local governments to be conscious of the fact that they have to ensure this work to the best extent possible to submit for those subsidies. Well, so what's the figure for 24? Well, we have to double check it. Do we have any more questions from the floor? Well, then let me wrap up with my question. Miss Nadia said very important words. The women don't have to be afraid to go to all those organizations. And we understand that the number of reports is just the tip of the iceberg. So what are the words we can use to talk to those women who were affected by the violence, that it's not untimely? Your security, your safety is always on time. I don't know, should I ask Ms. Halyna or Ms. Kateryna about this? Well, you know, thanks to the events like this, we have to continue talking. We have to encourage the mass media to bring this topic up, so that the women hear that yes, they should report, and they also should be aware that there is a broad range of those who can help. It can be a confidential online platform, it can be a telephone conversation with La Strada advisor, it can be a social worker, humanitarian worker, another expert. But at the same time, us as social workers, we understand how profound this problem is, and we're not gonna have too much reports because the war is still underway. Many people still cope with the matters of safety and security, and when those problems are solved, this is when women think about what happened to them and how to psychologically renew themselves. psychologically, mentally, physically. The experience of Scandinavian countries, of Balkan countries, it says that 10 years may pass before the women report, 20 years may pass after the end of the war before the women report. So we have to understand that those cases, they're going to surface on and on. Women will report after the end of the war. They will ask for help 10 years after the end of the war. It's a long process, and we should solve this problem on a systemic basis altogether. Thank you very much, Ms. Halyna. What I would like to add, first of all, I would like to add that on top of the existing services that we've mentioned, there were 11 centers aimed at support of the victims that work in Kharkiv, Kropyvnytsky, Chernivtsi, Lviv, Kiev, Odessa, Poltava, Dnipro, Zaporizhia, and this is where women can come and report. There is a psychotherapeutical platform called Aurora. You can Google it. It's an online platform, and you can only apply online. And there are more services that work in different regions. It's very important, and please make use of them. We will have another more extensive awareness campaign that I was mentioning in the beginning to unite the needs of those who are in need with the capabilities of those who work in Ukraine, because we have to unite them. And yet another thing I want to pay attention to is the problem of the men who were victims of the violence in development of services and organizations. We don't have to forget about the cases when men are affected by the violence. We don't talk about gender-based violence as only affecting women, but also men. It's related also, well, according to the details that we have from the Office of the Prosecutor General, the third of those affected by gender-based violence during the war are the men, and we have to solve this problem in coordination with our international partners. Thank you very much for bringing up this important topic. Let me remind you that within Brave&Hub, the main discussion platform of Ukraine, we were talking about gender-based violence and assistance to those affected by it. We will be back on Monday. Thank you for staying with us. Have a good weekend.